Welcome back. In the following section, we'll start looking at a core skill that every React developer needs to develop right from the beginning. And that core skill is to think in React. Now, thinking in React encompasses many different aspects, but in this section, we'll focus on state management. So you will learn when and where to create state variables, when and how to derive state, and also how to communicate between child and parent components by lifting state up. And all these new skills will be needed as we keep building our faraway application. So get ready for some more foundational React knowledge, and so let's dive right in. Let's start the section by discovering what thinking in React is actually all about. So, as you might have noticed by now, building React applications requires a completely new mindset, because it's just very different from building applications with vanilla JavaScript. So to build React apps, you not only need to learn how to work with the React API in practice, like with all the different functions like useState, but you also need to be able to think in React. So you need to basically enter the React mindset. Now, once you have both of these skills, you will have mastered React and you will be well on your way to building professional React applications. Now, what does thinking in React actually mean? Well, while you're building an application, thinking in React means that you have a very good mental model of how and when to use all the React tools like components, state, props, general data flow, effects, and many more. It's also about always thinking in terms of state transitions rather than in element mutations, as we have learned before. Now, you can also view thinking in React as a whole process, which can help us build apps in a more structured way. And the first step in this process is to break the desired UI into components and establish how these components are related to one another, so to establish the component tree. This also includes thinking about reusability and composability of components. After that, we can start by building a static version of the application, so without any state and interactivity. And this is great, because by doing this, we do most of the coding up front before having to worry about state and interactivity. That part comes next, so in step 3, where we think about state. So here we decide when we need state, what types of state we need, and where to place each piece of state. Then, finally, we think about establishing how data flows through the application. This includes thinking about one-way data flow, child-to-parent communication, and the way global state should be accessed. So these points 3 and 4 is what we collectively call state management, which is the main focus of this section. Now, of course, this is not a rigid process that we always need to follow to the letter. In practice, there's always a lot of back and forth between these different steps, and things are never this linear. But it's still good to have a process like this as an overall guideline. Okay, now once you really know how to think in React, you'll be able to answer questions like how to break up my UI design into components, how to make some of my components truly reusable, or how to assemble a user interface from reusable components. Now, we also think a lot about state, like what pieces of state do I need for the interactivity that I want, and where to then place each of these states. Or, in other words, what component should actually own each piece of state? Or what types of state can or should I use? And, in more general terms, how to make my data flow through the application. Now, as you might have noticed, we already started to talk about some of these topics before, but I still wanted to have one section where I really focus on some of these skills, so that you can start getting more and more into the React mindset. Now, of course, you will only really master these skills through practice and writing code. And lucky for you, we will do lots of that in this course. But we will also take a bit of a theoretical approach from time to time, just like in this video, because I believe that it's really, really important that I teach you these things besides just the React API itself. And by doing so, I make this course really as good as possible for you. And in my opinion, way better than all the other React courses out there. But anyway, let's now move on to looking at the fundamentals of state management. We learned before that state is the most important concept in React. Therefore, managing state is the most important aspect when it comes to thinking in React. And so, let's now talk about the fundamentals of state management in React. So, as you already know, we can use the useState function to create multiple pieces of state in order to track data that changes over the lifecycle of an application. Here we have many examples of state in the Udemy application that you are familiar with. And if you want, you can pause the video and quickly analyze this. Now, all this looks like a bit of a mess, right? Like, how do we know that we even need all of these pieces of state? And how do we know where exactly to place them inside the code? Well, that's where state management comes into play. Now, state management can be defined in different ways by different people, but I like to think of state management as deciding when we need to create new pieces of state, what types of state we need, where to place each piece of state inside our code base, and also how all that data should flow through the app. And to summarize all this, I like to use the analogy that state management is basically giving each piece of state a home within our code base. Now, up until this point, in our small apps, we never had to worry about state management at all. We simply placed each state in a component that needed it, and that's it. But as an application grows, the need to find the right home for each piece of state starts to become really important, no matter if that home is the component where we first need that state, some parent component, or even global state. And speaking of global state, let's actually analyze the difference between the big two types of state that exist in React: global state and local state. Now, this will only become more important to us later on, but let's still start learning about this inside this thinking about state section. So, in React, each piece of state is either local state or global state. So, local state is state that is only needed in one component or in a few different components, like child or sibling components. We simply create a piece of local state using the useState function inside a certain component. And that piece of state is then only accessible to that exact component and maybe to its child components if we pass the state using props. Now, going back to our Udemy app, an example of local state might be the input text in the search bar. So probably only that component needs to know about this data, and therefore this is local state. So state local to that search bar component. Now, about global state, this is state that many different components in the app might need access to. Therefore, when we define state as being global, that piece of state will become accessible to every single component in the entire app. It's shared between all components, and therefore we can also call this shared state. In practice, we can define global state using React's Context API or also an external global state management library like Redux that you might have heard of. Now, in this Udemy app, one piece of global state is the shopping cart. So that piece of data is used all over the place here. So all these components need access to the shopping cart state. And therefore, it makes sense that this is global state. Now, this distinction between local and global state will matter more in large applications. So in the app we're building right now, we won't have any truly global state. And we're actually going to keep using just local state doing parts 1 and 2 of this course. And in fact, one important guideline in state management is to always start with local state and only move to global state if you really truly need it. And we will learn all about this in part 3 and 4 of the course. But for now, let's take a look at how to decide when we actually need state and where we should place it. So this slide will basically be a flowchart that will help you take those decisions. So again, about when to create state and where to place it. So it all starts with you realizing that you need to store some data. Now, when this happens, the first question to ask is, will this data change at some point in time? And if the answer is no, then all you need is a regular variable, so probably a const variable. However, if the data does need to change in the future, the next question is, it is possible to compute or to calculate this new data from an existing piece of state or props? If that's the case, then you should derive the state. So basically calculate it based on an already existing state or prop. And this is a pretty important concept, so there is a separate lecture on derived state later in the section. However, most of the time you cannot derive state. And so in that case, you need to ask yourself whether updating the state should re-render the component. Now, we have already learned before that updating state always re-renders a component. But there is actually something called a ref, which persists data over time like regular state, but does not re-render a component. So it's basically a special type of state that we will look at later. Now, most of the time, you actually do want state to re-render the component. And so what you do is to create a new piece of state using the useState function. And you then place that new piece of state into the component that you are currently building. And so that's the always start with local state guideline that we talked about in the previous slide. And with this, we have completed the decision process of when to create state. So again, most of the time, you will just create a new piece of state using the useState hook. But there are also all these other cases. And so it's important that you are aware of when to create each of them. But anyway, let's now focus on where to place each new piece of state. So if the state variable that we just created is only used by the current component, then simply leave it in that component and you're done. So that's the end of the process right there. However, the state variable might also be necessary for a child component. And in that case, simply pass the state down into the child component by using props. So easy enough, right? Now, if the state variable is also necessary for one or a few sibling components, or even for a parent component of your current component, it's time to move that state to the first common parent component. And in React, this is what we call lifting state up. And this is another one of those super important topics, which we will actually start using in practice in the next video. Now, finally, the state variable might be needed in even more than just a few siblings. So it might be necessary all over the place in the component tree. And what does that sound like to you? Well, that's right. That sounds just like global state. But since we won't need global state for some time, we will complete this diagram once we reach the global state management lectures. All right, so I hope that this diagram will be useful once you start building your own small apps or even throughout the rest of the course. Now, I know that this might look super confusing and like a lot of work for now, but it will become really intuitive over time. So at some point, you will just automatically and intuitively know when to create a piece of state, you will know when to derive state from existing state, and you will intuitively know when to lift state up. But this flowchart can still be quite helpful in the beginning. Welcome back to the faraway application that we started building in the previous section. And now let's add some important state to the app and then also lift that state up. But before we start doing that, let's recap where we left off at the end of the previous section. So remember how we made our form here with these two controlled elements. So the state of these two elements is controlled here inside the form component with the description and the quantity state. Then, whenever this form here is submitted, the submit event will fire off. And so then we are handling that submit event here using the onSubmit prop with the handleSubmit function. So this function right here. Then if there is a description, we create this new item object, which right now we are only logging to the console. So let's try that. And so you see, we got an object with a description, the quantity, the packed status set to false by default, and some random ID right here. Okay. But again, right now we are only logging this piece of information, so this new object here, to the console. But now let's do actually something else. So we want to store this information somewhere. And to help us with that, we can actually use the flowchart that we just looked at in the previous lecture. So we already know that we want to store some piece of information. Now, will that data, so that information, change at some point in the future? Well, yes, it definitely will each time that we add a new item to the items list. Now, can that data be computed from existing state or props? Well, no, it cannot. So therefore, we cannot derive state. Then the next question in our flowchart is whether this new data should actually re-render the component whenever it is updated. And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And so therefore, as we already expected, the result of this first part of the flowchart is that we need to create a new piece of state in the component that we are currently building. And so with this, we finish the first half here of the flowchart, which is about when to create a new piece of state. Now back here in our code, let's actually do that. So let's create a new state variable called items. And then as always, we have our setter function, in this case called setItems. And so then use state. And now what do you think will be the default value for this state variable? Well, remember that these items here are basically the packing items that are displayed here in the UI. And so this, remember, is an array. And therefore, our initial state for the items is just an empty array. So when we open up a new packing list, so when we open up this app for the first time, of course, we don't want to have any items. And so that's what the empty array here basically is. Okay, and so now let's actually use the setItems function here to add our new items to the items array. And actually, let's do that in a separate function. And let's call that handle add items. And this function will receive a new item object, which it will then add to the items array. So let's actually immediately call the function here. So here we will call handle add items and then with the new item that we just create. So for example, with an item that looks just like this. So that's what we pass in here. And now, again, it's time to use setItems to update our items array. And this new items array will basically be the current items array plus the new item added to the end. And so what this means is that the new state depends on the current state. And therefore, here we now need to pass in a callback function. So not just a single value. So let's call the current state here in this callback items. And then here, let's see what we need to do. So remember that in React, we are not allowed to mutate state. So we cannot do this. So we can not simply push the new item into the items array, because with that, we would be mutating. So we would be changing this items array right here. And again, that's really not allowed in React. So React is all about immutability. And so the solution here is to create a brand new array, which contains all the current items plus the new one. So let's return a new array. And then in there, we simply spread the current items. And then we add another item, which is simply called item. So the item that we are receiving here. Now, if this looks strange to you, then please go back to the review of Essential JavaScript section, where I have a couple of videos on how to work with arrays in an immutable way. So basically how to add new items, how to update, and how to delete items from an array without mutating the original. So in React, that's something that we need to do all the time. And so again, if you're not sure how that works, then please go back to that section, because from now on, I will simply assume that you know how to do this. Okay, so this is already done. So we now have a way of adding new items to the state. And so let's immediately test that here. So let's use now 10 test items. And so we are still logging them to the console, but now I want to draw your attention here again to the DevTools. And in particular, of course, to the form component that we are working with now. And so down here, we already have our state, which already has this new item that we just created. Nice. So let's do another one for like boarding passes. And you see, immediately it got also added to our items array. So our updating logic here is working just fine. But of course, this state is now nowhere being displayed in the UI yet, right? So we are not using this items variable anywhere in our JSX yet. And the reason for that is that actually we do not need these items in this current component. The only goal of the form component is to add new items to this array, but not to render it. Instead, remember that who renders these items is actually the packing list component. So that's this one here, right? But with this, we now created ourselves a problem. So let's take a closer look here at the component tree. So right now, our item state is here inside the form component, right? And so this is where we update the state. However, we need the state itself. So we need this item state variable here in the packing list, because again, this is where it should actually be rendered onto the UI. And so now, how do we get this state from the form to the packing list? Well, we cannot pass it as a prop, because the form is not a parent component of packing list. It is simply a sibling component, but data can only flow down the tree. It cannot flow up the tree or sideways. So therefore, we cannot simply pass these items to the packing list via props. Instead, we now need to use a technique that I mentioned before, which is to lift up state. So what we're going to do now is to take this state here, so this line of code, and we will move it to the closest common parent component. So which one is that? Well, it's simply the app component, right? So this component is both a parent of the form and of the packing list, which are the two components which need this state. So again, let's grab this and let's move to our app and add the state right there. And then of course we get these errors here because setItems is no longer defined in the form. So let's fix that in a minute, but I want to start by now passing the items here into the packing list. So we define a new prop called items into which we pass the items array. All right, then let's come to the packing list and accept that prop there. So remember, we can immediately destructure the props object here. And then instead of the initial items, we will now finally render the actual items. And with this, we have now used the item state in our JSX, right? And now let's take care here of this handle at items function. So actually I will grab this entire function and move it here. And so now all we have to do in order to enable the form to update the state is to pass in this handle at items function. So let's do that. Let's create a new prop, and kind of a convention is to call this now on at items handle at items. So we could of course call it the exact same prop name here. So we could create a prop called handle at items and then pass it a function with the same name, but it's kind of a convention for it to be like this. So it then becomes a bit more readable, like on at items, call handle at items. So if that makes sense. And then here, let's accept that on at items. And finally, here we now need to call, of course, the function with this prop. So with this prop name, on at items. And with this, we fixed all the errors that we had, but probably what we just did here is quite a bit confusing. So let me first now add a new item here, just to see if it works, and then I will explain what's actually happening a bit better. So let's see, and there it is. So we created a new item here. It was then added into the item state, which now lives in the app. Let's check that. Yep, that's right. Here it is. And so then that state got passed down here into the packing list, which received it as a props. And we can see that right here also in the DevTools. So here we now have the items as a prop, and then of course that gets rendered to the UI. Let's try another one. And immediately it got added here to the, well, to this state right here, which was then passed down into the packing list. And now about updating the state, this is what happened. So we now have our handle at items function right here in the app, which is exactly where the piece of state also lives. So where we have the home of the items state. And so all the logic about updating that state is here in the same component. However, it is the form that is actually responsible for creating new items. And so therefore, we need to give this component, so this form component here, access to a function that can update the state. And so that function is handle at items. So as I mentioned before, we can actually pass anything as a prop. And so that includes functions. So here we pass in handle at items as a prop, and we call that prop on at items, which of course, again, could also be called handle at items, which some people prefer, but many times you will see this convention. So then we come here, destructure the props, and then we call that function whenever the form is submitted. And that's it. So this is how we lift up state. So basically what that means is that whenever multiple sibling components need access to the same state, we move that piece of state up to the first common parent component, which again in our case here was the app component. All right, and we will actually review this one more time in the next lecture. But for now, let's move back to our flowchart and quickly complete it. So basically, we will just review what we just did and then see how we would have arrived at that solution here with the flowchart. So the new state that we created, was it only used in the initial component, so only used in the form? No, it was not. So then we move here and we ask ourselves, is the state also needed by a child component? And again, the answer is no, because instead it was needed by a sibling component. And so therefore, that is how we lifted state up to the first common parent. All right, so make sure to take another look at the code that we just wrote, and then in the next video, we will take an even closer look at this concept of lifting up state. So we just created an important piece of state and lifted it up to a parent component that is common to both components that need to use or to update that state, right? However, this whole idea might still be a bit confusing because, in fact, it can seem quite counterintuitive. And so let's now look at another example and some diagrams to really understand how lifting up state works and why it's so important. And as an example, let's use the checkout part of the Udemy interface that we have seen in a previous lecture. And let's say that we started by building this promotions component where the user can input coupon codes that will then be added to a list of applied coupons. So that sounds like we need a piece of state called coupons right here, right? So that coupon state is now local to the promotions component along with a setCoupons function coming from useState. Now next, we set out to build the total component. But here, we quickly realize that the total component also needs access to the coupon state. Otherwise, without knowing which coupons have been applied, how would the total component know what discounts to apply and what price to display? And so here we encounter a problem. How do we give the total component access to the coupon state? Because in React, we have one-way data flow. So data can only flow down from parents to children, but not sideways to sibling components. Therefore, we cannot simply pass the coupons data as props to the total component. That's just not possible. And so we need a way of sharing state with other components that are further up or sideways in the component tree. But luckily for us, we already did exactly that in the last lecture with the item state by lifting it up. And so we already know that lifting up state is the technique that will solve this problem. But what does that mean and how exactly does it work? Well, lifting state up simply means to place some state in a component that is a parent of both components that need the piece of state in question. So in this example, we would remove the coupon state from promotions and place it in the checkout component. And just like this, we have lifted state up to the closest common parent of both total and promotions. And now giving both these components access to the state is as easy as passing it down using props. And that's it. So by lifting state up, we have just successfully shared one piece of state with multiple components in different positions in the component tree, which is something that we need to do all the time in React apps. And so it's really important that you get used to this pattern. And remember that we need this pattern in the first place as a direct consequence of React's one-way data flow. But anyway, all this now seems to be working just fine at this point. But now, what happens when we want to add a new coupon to the coupon state? Or in other words, what happens when the user inputs a new coupon and clicks on the apply button? Well, we want to update the coupon state, right? But how do we do that now? Because after lifting the state up, it now lives in the parent component. So not in the promotions component anymore. Promotions only receive this data via props. But as you know, we cannot mutate props. So that's one of the hard rules of React. So what we're asking here is, if we have one-way data flow, so if data can only flow from parents to children, then how can the child component promotions update the state that lives in the parent component checkout? Well, actually, the solution is quite simple. All we have to do is to also pass the setCoupons function down as a prop to the components who need to update the state. And so now that we have the setCoupons function in promotions, Once a new coupon is added, we can simply use setCoupons to update the state that lives in the parent component. And this is actually exactly what we also did in the previous lecture, with the difference that we didn't directly pass setItems, but a function that uses setItems to update the items, which is essentially the same thing. But anyway, we can call this technique of passing down a setter function child-to-parent communication, or also inverse data flow. Inverse because usually data only flows down, but here we basically have a trick that allows us to basically have the data flowing up as well. Now, of course, this is not truly flowing up, but this workaround of passing down the setter function and use it to update the parent state is pretty close to actually having data flowing up the tree. Now, when I first learned about this technique years ago, it actually took me quite some time to wrap my head around this whole idea, because this can actually be quite confusing. And so that's why I created an extra lecture with all these diagrams for you, hoping that you will have an easier time understanding child-to-parent communication. But that's enough talk. Let's now go back to our code and use this in practice a few more times. Next up, let's take care of updating items by toggling their packed status. So basically, that's the functionality that I showed you by the end of the previous lecture, right? So this is what we want to implement in our app now. And so to start, we actually need to create those checkboxes there. So right now we don't even have that checkbox. And so let's go here to our item. And before the span, let's now add an input of the type, and here we want a string, so of the type checkbox. So that's something. So we can actually already toggle this one here on and off now, but of course it's not going to do anything. So basically we want to also transform this element right here into a controlled element. And remember, a controlled element means that the element has the value defined by some state, and it also has an event handler which listens for the change and updates the state accordingly. So let's do those two things. And first, the value will be given by the item.checked status. And so this checked here is always a true or false value. And so that is exactly the type of value that we need to pass into the value of a checkbox. And actually here it should be packed and not checked, which maybe you had already noticed. But anyway, now let's keep going here. And so now next up, we need to add onChange handler. So we need to listen for the change event, which basically happens each time that we click here on the checkbox. Now here, for now, let's actually specify just an empty function, so a function that doesn't do anything. And here we're missing this. All right. And so the reason for that is that, of course, this function here that we are eventually going to specify here is going to change the packed value of the item state, right? And so that function will once again be placed where the state actually lives, so inside of app. And then we will pass it down using a prop, just like we did with onDeleteItem. So this is something similar. So instead of deleting an item, we will simply now update one item. And so again, that update happens each time that we click here on the checkbox. So let's now write that function here. So function, and again, starting with the handle keyword, and then toggle item. And that's because here we will only toggle the packed property. So not allow anyone to update the entire object, but only really to change the value of that packed property. So in order to know which object we actually need to change, we need to again pass in the ID. And so then let's again set the items, and then we need to pass in a new array, which just like before will depend on the current array. So we have our callback function here. And so now in order to update one of the objects in the array, we will simply loop over the entire items array using the map property, which will then in the end return a brand new array with the same length of the initial items array. But one of the objects will then of course have been updated. So in the iteration, each of the elements is called an item. And then here is what we're going to do. So whenever the item has the ID that is equal to the ID that we passed in, so which means that this is the object that we want to actually update, then we create a brand new object based on the current item, and then we set packed to the opposite of packed, so of item.packed. And that's it. And if else, so for all the other objects, we will simply return the current item. And just once again, I want to emphasize that I covered exactly that this is how we update an object in an array in great depth in the section where we review essential JavaScript for React. So please go there in case that this looks strange. But for everyone else, let's just keep going here. And now also add this function here into the packing list so that the packing list can then add it into the item. So we use once again the props basically as a communication channel here. So on toggle items, handle toggle item. So on toggle item right here. And now let's just copy this, add it here to the list of props, exactly like this. And then we pass it into the item itself. Let's do that here. All right, and finally we receive it here. So again, we need to use the packing list here as an intermediary step in order to reach the item itself. And so now here we can then replace this empty function with calling on toggle item with, just like before, the current ID, so that we actually know which is the object that we need to change. All right, and that's actually it. Or at least it should be. So let's see if that works. So 1 socks, let's say 1 shirt and 1 charger. And now as we click here, yeah, beautiful. So it updates our checkbox and you see that it also updates here the strike through. So that's coming exactly here from when the item is packed. And the same of course works for all the other ones, because if we click on this one, then the item.id will be another one. And so therefore then this function here receives another value, which will then update another object. And deleting here, of course, also works. And so, yeah, we are done with building these two operations that we can perform on items. So toggling their packed status and deleting them. Now, before moving on, please just make sure to review the code that we wrote here. So just to make sure that you understand basically everything that's happening here, why we are doing it this way, and the way we then passed in these functions as props all the way down until the components that actually need them. So this is again child to parent communication, which is something that we're going to use all the time. And so make sure that you really understand this concept as well as lifting up state until you move on to the next lecture, which is going to be about derived state. Another aspect that I mentioned in the state management lecture was derived state. Sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So essentially, derived state is simply state that is computed from another existing piece of state, or also from props. But let's look at some actual code. So here we have 3 pieces of state, as we can see by the 3 useState function calls. However, if we analyze these states, it actually doesn't make much sense that all of them exist, because num items and total price depend entirely on the cart. So num items is simply the number of items in the cart, and total price is the sum of all the prices in the cart. And so all the data for these two pieces of state is actually already in the cart. So there's no need to create these additional state variables. And doing so is actually quite problematic. First, because now we have to keep all these states in sync. So we need to be careful to always update them together. So in this situation, whenever we update the cart, we would also need to manually update the number of items and the total price. Otherwise, our states would get out of sync. But updating these three states separately creates a second problem, because that will then re-render the component 3 times, which is absolutely unnecessary in this example. Instead, we can simply derive the num items and total price state from the cart and therefore solve all these problems, because the cart already contains all the data that we need. So here we simply calculate num items as the cart length and total price as the sum of all prices and store them in regular variables. There is no useState required here, which will cause no unnecessary re-renders. The cart state acts as a single source of truth for these related pieces of state, making sure that everything will always stay in sync. And this works because updating the cart will re-render the component, which means that the function is called again. And so then, as all the code is executed again, num items and total price will also automatically get recalculated. Now, of course, most of the time we cannot derive state, but whenever you have a situation like this one, where one state can easily be computed from another, always prefer derived state. So don't create 2 state variables if you actually only need one. That's a very common beginner mistake, but now you will be able to avoid it. Of course, let's now use the idea of derived state in practice. And in particular, we now want to calculate our statistics here. So calculating the number of items on the list, how many we already have packed, and then the percentage of that. Now, if we think about these numbers, for example, the number of items in the list, that number can be directly computed from the items array itself, right? And so derived state is perfect for this. But before we use derived state, I will show you how not to do this. So the way we should not do it is to use state. So let's say we created a piece of state called num items and then set num items. And by the way, you don't need to write this code right here. All right. So this is just to show you how not to do it. So initially we start with 0 items. Now the problem with this is, as I said before, is that we now have to also update this piece of state. So whenever, for example, one new item is added, besides setting the items, we also need to make sure to increase this number here. So set num items, and then the number, and then num plus 1. So with this, we would ensure that these two pieces of state stay in sync. But that's of course a lot of additional work that we might forget to do, and also it can cause multiple re-renders, where at least one of them here is unnecessary. Now in React 18, these should be batched, so these two should happen at the same time, but more about that later. But in any case, this is a terrible idea. So instead, we can just define a new variable called also num items, but we can simply derive it. So we can calculate it based on the items array. So that's simply items dot length. And so this works because as soon as the items are updated, so as soon as this piece of state is updated, the component will re-render. And when the component re-renders, that means that the function here is called again. And therefore, then this piece of code here will run again. And so if a new item has been added, then now the item state, so this array is different, and therefore the length will also be different. Now this numItems variable, we actually don't need it right here in the app component, but in the stats component. So this one right here. So we have two options now. The first one is to keep numItems here and pass it as a prop into stats. But I think what makes more sense is to actually calculate this state here, so this derived state, inside the stats itself. Also because we will actually calculate 3 values, and so if we were to calculate them here, then we would have to pass 3 props, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's just cut that from here and paste it here into the items. Well, actually no, that's not correct. Want to paste it right here. But now as soon as I save this, we will get an error, right? And so the reason for that is that now, of course, we don't know. So this stats component doesn't know anything about what this items is. So we now have another component that needs the item state. So we just pass it down as a prop. Just like we passed it also into the packing list. Now, of course, we need to accept that prop down here. And so this solves the problem. And so here we can now already use that value. So you have num items on your list. And so yeah, indeed right now that's 0. But if I add some socks here and maybe a shirt, then you see as soon as we add new items here, the array grows. And so then this number here also gets updated. So watch what happens when I hit enter, and immediately this changed from 2 to 3. Let's just quickly remove those console.logs there. So that's much better. And so now let's derive our other pieces of state. So of course, this one here, so the ones that are already packed, and the percentage both depend on the items themselves. So number of packed is simply the items array filtered by the items that are already packed. So item.packed. So that's a new array. And so then we can take the length of that one. So you have already packed number of packed. And so that immediately becomes 0. But then when we mark one of them as packed, beautiful. So 2 and then all of them. Great. And now finally, just the percentage, which should be pretty easy. So that's just the number of packed divided by the number of items times 100. And then let's grab all of that and round it. So math.round. And so here then we can replace that. Nice. That also works. And now it hits 100%. And in that case, so whenever we have 100%, I would like to display an entirely different message here. So telling them basically that they are done. So watch what happens here in the demo. Yeah, that's it. So let's write that here. And so for that, we need some more conditional rendering. So actually, we will just conditionally define what is here inside this M element. So let's enter our JavaScript mode and say that whenever the percentage is equal to 100, then the content should be this string right here. You got everything ready to go. Now let's add a plain emoji here as well. And now else. And so let's move that here. And so now instead of this text that we had here, we now need a string. And so let's make a template literal here. And then we need to add, of course, these. And in case we didn't want to create this template literal, we could, of course, also have simply rendered one EM for each of these cases. Now this looks not correct. Maybe it's because of this right here. Yeah, but it looks as though it works, even though we are in the wrong app. But here we already have our correct message. Let's uncheck one of those. And now you have 3 items on your list. Great. Now let's remove this one and this one as well. And so now we have already packed 0. And also in this case, I want to display something else as well. So also another message. So if this is the case, if there are not even any items in the array, then it's not even necessary actually to perform all these calculations, because they will just be 0 anyway. So what I want to do now here is to show you a good use case of an early return as conditional rendering. So what we're going to do is to say if there is no items.length, then simply return, so let's return a paragraph with the class of footer, and then here also an EM, and then start adding some items to your packing list. And again, some nice emoji here, like this rocket. And so now let's reload this here so that we then have no items. And so yeah, here we go. Now here, the class name is not footer, but stats. So basically the same as here. And so yeah, then we got this. So this text that we defined right here, so this paragraph. And again, that's because in this case, it doesn't even make sense to then do these calculations. So if there are no elements anyway in the array, then don't even bother with all of this here. Now, in this case, of course, it would have been no problem to still do these calculations as they are not a lot of work. And we could then have some conditional rendering in here. But this was just to show you that the option of an early return is sometimes also nice. So it's also quite legible here, if you ask me. So when you arrive at this component, maybe you have never seen it before because one of your coworkers wrote it, then you can right away see that if there are no items, well, then just return this. And in all other cases, then perform the rest of the logic of the component. Great. So hopefully that made sense. And so next up, let's see another use case of derived state, which will be to implement this sorting functionality here. So that will make this application look even more real life. And so I think this is going to be really fun. Let's add a new feature to our application, which is to allow users to sort the items by 3 different criteria. So basically, we will build this select box right here, and then from there, the user can choose which of these criteria they want to sort the list by. So something that's very common in most web applications. And so let's now build a very simple version of that. So we will do this here right in the packing list component, because if we were to create a new component just for this, then we would add a little bit of extra work with lifting some more state up. And I want to keep it simple here and not to confuse you even further. And so, yeah, it's no problem to just do it right here in the packing list right after this div right here. Or actually, let's do it right here after this unordered list. So let's create a div with the class name that I already created called actions, because here we will have that select element and later also a button to clear the entire list. So inside the select element, as always, we need the option element, which should have different values. And so then later, based on these values here, we will calculate the ordered list. So the first one is based on input. And so these are just some strings that we are making up here. So input is basically by the input order. Then, well, let's write that here first. So sort by the input order. so by the order in which these items were actually placed into the list. Next up, we want to sort by description. So sort by description, so basically alphabetically. And then finally, let's also do, which is very nice, by the packed status. So sort by packed status. Nice. So there it is. Looks great. And so now let's see how we can actually implement this. So first of all, of course, we need to know inside the component, so inside our React application, what the currently selected element here is. And so for that, we will once again transform this here into a controlled element. So for that, we need our 3 steps. So first of all, we create a new piece of state. Let's call this one sort by and set sort by. Use state. And now our default will be the very first one here. So we want that by default, they are sorted by input. And so this input here is exactly this string that we defined here. But it could also be description or packed. And so now let's use that state here as the value. So sort by. And if here I used packed instead, then we should already see that reflected in the UI. So you see that here we now have by default sort by packed status, because now I used this string. Now React is complaining, and that's because we are missing the third part, which is to now attach the onChange event handler so that we can then set the state based on whatever the user selected there. So onChange, and this function here will automatically receive the event, and then we can set sort by using event.target.value. So at some point you will get really used to writing this kind of thing here, and it will become second nature. So this is like a recipe that we always need to follow, and it always works in the exact same way, really. So let's see. And yeah, that works nice. And if we check out our component here, then we first of all need more space. And then you see down here, we now have the sort by status inside our state, inside our component. Great. And so now we can work with this. So how do we now get React? So how do we get our application to display the items here sorted by whatever criteria we selected? Well, basically, we will just create a new items, which is then sorted by that criteria. So we are not going to manipulate the original items array. That state should stay unchanged. Instead, we will now use again derived state, because sorting one array can of course be computed based on that initial array. That makes total sense, right? So once again, we will not create a new state variable here, because that's totally unnecessary. We will simply create a new variable, and here actually a let variable. So sorted items. And we're using a let so that now we can simply do a couple of simple if statements. So if sort by is equal to input, then this is the default, right? And so then in this case, we can simply say that sorted items should be just equal to the original items. So this is wrong here, of course. So again, in this case, the sorted items are just equal to the items themselves. So the ones that we receive as a prop here. And so now, of course, in the end, we need to use these sorted items. And that's right here. So from now on, instead of rendering the original items array, we will always render the sorted items. All right. And let's just put some here, socks, a charger. So these are quite easy to write. Yeah, right now only this one here works. So if I do this now, then we get an error because sorted items is then just this empty variable that React doesn't know how to render. So, well, now I will have to write everything again here. So socks, a shirt, and a charger. All right. And now let's write one if for the other two cases. So if our sort by change is, that's a description, then we will want to sort our items. Actually, so sorted items will then become items. And now first we use slice, because with this we basically take a copy of the array. And that's very important because the sort method is a mutating method. And so if we didn't do this, then the items would actually get sorted as well. So we don't want that. So we use slice dot sort. And now here I will just write the code because, again, I already explained exactly how this method works in the review of JavaScript section. Now, in this case, since we want to sort alphabetically, we can use the local compare method. So we want to take A, which is basically one object of the array, and then we want to take the description of that, which is one of the properties of each object. And then, since this is a string, we can call local compare, and then here we simply pass in another string, which is b.description. All right, so this is going to work, hopefully at least. And then finally, let's also add the code for our last case, which is by packed. And so something very similar here. Sorted items is going to be equal to items, taking a copy, dot sort, and then A and B, which are basically two objects of the array, which are being compared. And then since we want to order by the packed status, which is a Boolean, we need to first convert that to a number. So A.packed minus number B.packed. And that's it. So let's try this out. So by description, you see that now it's alphabetically. So CSS. And finally, by the packed status. So right now, all of them are unpacked. So let's click, and you see that then it moves to the end. And the same thing right here. Then if I remove it, it will move back here. Great. And of course, we also have our default, which is the input order, which is also the same. That happens whenever we are in the packed status and we have none of them packed in. Great. So that's just amazing. We just implemented this simple feature, but also a very common feature, simply by using the power of derived state. So again, we didn't create any new piece of state for the sorted items. The only state that we need is the sort by state, so that React actually has at all times the value of this input field right here. And then based on that, we simply create this derived state of sorted items, which then in the end is what we render onto the user interface. And with this, the only thing that we have left to do is to add this button here to clear the list. And so that's the task of the next video. Let's now make our application feature complete by adding a button to clear up the entire list at once. And so to do that, let's come down here, and after the select, we're going to add a simple button. So not like that, but button clear list. So there it is. And now, as always, we need to add the onClick event handler, and then we need a function that basically deletes all of these elements here at once. Now I think that this might be a nice challenge for you. So creating that function that deletes everything, and then passing that function down to this component and adding it here onto the button. So that shouldn't be all too hard. And so please go ahead and pause the video right now. So try this on your own really, as this is a really nice learning experience. And then I see you back here in a minute or 5 once you are finished with that task. Okay. So I will create a function close to all the other functions. So we have handle add items, delete, and toggle. And so we simply add just another one. So handle clear list, which doesn't need anything really. And then all we need to do here is to simply say set items back to the original value, which was of course this empty array. And that's it. So that's almost too simple, but now we just need to connect this function to the button. So that button is in the packing list, so that's where we pass this into a prop. So on clear list will be handle clear list. And so now let's get that. So this packing list really receives a lot of props. And so then here, the onClick prop, and here we don't even need to create a new function. All we have to do is to pass this one in. So on clear list. Give it a save, and that should be it. So clear list, and yes, everything is gone. Great. So I'm hoping that you did this as well. And now just one more thing here is that here in this demo app is that here we prevent the user from accidentally deleting everything. So here when they click on clear list, first we get if we want to delete all the items, and only then if we click on OK, everything will get deleted. So you see, now it is empty. So let's quickly do the same thing here, and that's pretty easy because that's just a standard DOM function. So that's a function that's not really part of JavaScript, but it's part of the web API. But anyway, here we can create some variable, let's say confirmed, and then that confirmed will be defined by window.confirm. So here we can then pass in any string. So that's going to be the message that the user will see. So are you sure you want to delete all items? And then when the user clicks on OK, confirmed will become true. And in the case they click cancel, then it will be false. And so now we can do this conditionally. So we just say if confirmed, then set items to the empty array. Just to make sure, let's reload and shorts and a charger. And now when I clear the list, then yes, we get the confirm and it works beautifully. Now, maybe you got a little bit annoyed at all the scrolling that we had to do here now lately because our components were getting bigger and bigger. So whenever we wanted like to pass in something here, then we had to scroll all the way down here to then accept, for example, these props right here. And so that's why I said in the very beginning that in real world applications, we usually have one component per file. And so in the next lecture, I will show you a trick of how we can basically divide this one file into multiple files. So one file per component. So let's now split up our app.js file into multiple component files. And this will just be a very simple exercise of taking each of these components and placing them into their own file. So you can even do that on your own if you want. But anyway, let's just grab this code here, cut it, and then create a new file inside source. So inside this source folder, create logo.js, which is the name of this component, right? All right. But now, of course, we also have to export this function from here. And remember that in JavaScript, we can export in two ways. So we can have named exports, which would simply be this. So with this, we would create an export called logo, which we would then have to import with exactly that name into the other file. So into the file where we need it. But usually in React apps, what we do is to use a default export. So export default, just like this. And then of course, now if we try to reload this, we will get an error that, well, not this one, yeah, right here. So we see that the logo is not defined. And so of course, that's because now we have to import it right here. So import, and here actually we can use any name that we want. So because we used a default export. But of course, we will still call it logo here. So import logo from, and then simply the path to that file. And yes. And again, we could indeed change the name here to X, for example, and then here as well. Give it a save, and you see that it still works. But again, this is of course not advisable. This is just to show you how named and how default exports work. All right. Now let's take the next one. And by the way, the first one here will of course stay in this file because it is called app, and this file is also already called app.js. So let's grab the next one here. Okay, cut it, new file, form.js, paste it here, and then again, export default. Coming back here, then we need to import form from, just like this. Now here we will still get an error because we haven't imported useState in that other component. So let's quickly grab this line of code here, move into the form, which is where we are using useState, and then we also need to import that hook, so this useState function here into this file. Of course, because this file here does use that function. So it's not enough to just include it one time anywhere in the code. You really have to include the parts of React that you need in each single component file. So let's close this one and this one. And now that we have done it 2 times manually, it's actually time to do it automatically. So let's again select all of this. We can even click this triangle here to collapse the function. And so then we can select all of it and then right click here and then click on refactor. And so now here, this gives us the option to move this function into a new file. So let's click that. And you see that a brand new file with the name of packing list was created. So VS Code automatically took this function here and then created a new file with this exact same name. And it also automatically imported all the parts that we need inside this function. So we have useState and we also have item. Well, this actually doesn't make a lot of sense at this point because the item is still here. So that's actually not ideal, but we will fix that in a moment. So what matters here for now is that VS Code automatically created this new file, placed this new component here, and also exported it. Now it's actually using a named export. So you can see here that it's importing it in this other way. So this is how you do a named import. But again, we usually in React development do default exports. But of course, the other way is also perfectly fine. So I will just change it here. Export default. And then here I need to change the way I import it. So getting rid of these curly braces. And now let's also create a new component for this item here. So let's just remove this export. Select everything, refactor, and move to a new file. So again, item was created. And here we need to actually write export default, give it a save. And now we need to change that in the packing list because now this component is no longer in app, but inside of item.js. And it's again a default export. So we need to import it basically as a default import. All right, so this small thing here happened because we first exported the packing list which depended on the item. But yeah, in any case, usually we do this immediately. So usually when we build some app, we do immediately create a new file for when we need a new component. So let's do that one final time. So stats, let's change it again to export default just to stay consistent. And then fix it here as well. And with this, we now have one component per file, which makes our component here a little bit easier to manage. So then there's not so much scrolling up and down, but instead, well, we can develop basically each component in isolation in its separate file. Now, taking it one step further, we can also move each of the components into a new components folder. So components, and then let's select all of them actually. So everything except for index.js, which is not a component, and our CSS file. Grab them here, and now we only have one problem, which is the app file cannot be found here in index.js. So here we need to now fix this path to components/app. And with this, we are finished. So all the other files still work the same, or actually this one here. So here the imports still work because all the components are still in the same folder as app.js. And with this, we actually finished this project. So once again, congratulations for finishing your first, a bit more real React project. So a project that actually does something. So I think this was a really great practice project, quite straightforward, but it had all the most important fundamentals that you needed to know at this stage. Now, of course, this is not a real-world application, but in large-scale apps, you actually have many smaller parts in which you will need exactly these skills. And so everything that you are learning here is really, really important. It will lay the foundation so that later you can build those large and real-world applications. Now, next up in this section, we have a nice exercise where together we're going to build an accordion component. And then I just want to show you one other very important part of React. So that's going to be the children prop. And so, yeah, stay tuned for that. It's now time for another exercise so that together we can practice state management and thinking in React in general a little bit more. So together we will build this very simple accordion component where we can open and close each of these items of the accordion here. So when it's closed and we click, it opens, and when it's open and we click, it basically closes again. And each of these items has the title, or actually the number here, the title, and then the text itself. So this is here a question, and this is an answer, basically. And so we have some starter files again, which I have linked in this lecture, and the starter files are this array of frequently asked questions, and then also this CSS styles right here. So as always, you have two options. You can do it in your own VS Code. So then just go here and copy all the relevant starter data. Or of course you can fork now this code sandbox. So basically in order to create your own one. And so now I have created a new one out of the other one. And so I can safely change this one. So let's go back here to see what we have to build. And basically the entire thing here is the accordion component. And then each of them is one accordion item. And so let's start by actually building these items themselves. And remember that each one gets a number, a title, and some text. So the accordion component has actually already been created. And so now, next, let's create the accordion item. Okay. So remember that each item gets a number, it gets the title, and the text. And so let's immediately write that here basically as the props that we will receive. And so then we can immediately build with these. So just like before, we will start by building a static version of the app. So in this case of these two components. And then later we add state to the mix in order to actually make the component dynamic. So here we will return a div element. And this div has the class name that's coming from the CSS that I provided of item. Then we can immediately close that. And so then we have one paragraph for the number. So that's class name number. And then here, let's actually immediately use, again, this prop that we will receive as soon as we start including this component here anywhere. But we can already use that prop as if it already existed. So class name, then let's say text. And again here, the same thing. Let's immediately use the prop. And then finally, this one here for the icon. And by icon, I mean this minus and plus right here. So see how it toggles between plus and minus. And for now, let's start with a minus there, but we will change that later. And finally, we then have a div which will contain the content itself. So basically the text. So here the class name is content box. And then this, again, is where the actual text goes. And I see that here I have a mistake because this is actually for the title. So I'm not sure why I called that text, so the class, but yeah, never mind. Okay, and now here in this accordion, all we need to do is to loop over this array of objects like we always do. And then for each of the objects, we want to render one of these items. And actually to make this a bit more reusable, let's accept some generic data here, basically. And so then here we pass that data in. And as the data, we use the FAQs. And so then we could reuse this same accordion with different arrays. Okay, this one here should have the class name of accordion. And then here is where the mapping will happen. So that's data.map. And then for each of these elements, and we could also call them frequently asked question, but let's just go for the generic element. And so, as we said before, we want to render one accordion item for each of them. And what do we want to pass in there? Well, the title will be at element.title. So that's this one here. And then also the text coming from that same object. So element.text. And now we also want the number. So this one here should automatically be number 1, 2, and 3. So we can do that very easily by using the index that is also passed in the map. And that's very easy to do because the callback here in the map actually also gets passed the current index. So besides the current element, it also gets the current index. So as a second argument, so let's call that I. And so then we can pass in as num simply I. And that's it. All right, so we have something here. Let's just make this a bit smaller. Well, not all of it. Let's maybe close down the sidebar. Yeah, that's a lot better. Can make it a bit smaller even. And so let's compare. So here we actually have like 0, 1. And then also the text here looks a bit different. So let's see. But yeah, the class names all look correct. But now let's just quickly take care of the numbers here. So here we want to have 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3. So let's do some magic here. Let's say if the number is less than 9, then here please place a 0 and then the number plus 1. But if not, so right here, then it's just number plus 1. Okay, that looks much better. And then here, let's just change this one to title. So that should work. And yeah. And with this, let's go back to the original, because now we need to start thinking about state. So remember how we can open and close each of these boxes here individually, which basically means that each of these boxes holds their own state. So whenever we click here, you see that the UI changes. So that's the most fundamental thing that we need to think about. Whenever the UI changes, so whenever there is some update here happening in the UI, it means that we need a piece of state. Now, each of these items here operates completely independently from the other ones. So if I open this one here, nothing happens to the other two. So I can open all of them at the same time, or I can have all of them close, meaning that, again, each of them really operates in an independent way, which means that each of them must hold their own state. So again, that's because this one can be open, but this one as well. And so what that means is that we should now define a state variable in each of these items. So that's right here. And so then we use our friend useState. So let's call our state variable isOpen and set isOpen. So useState, which was then automatically imported. So this one right here, make sure you have that. And then by default, it will be false. So by default, we want each box to be closed. So we declared our state variable, and now let's use it. So that's the same 3-step process as always. We define it, we use it, and then we update it. So basically what we want to do when isOpen is false, so when this is closed, is to not display this content box down here. Or in other words, we want some conditional rendering of this part. So let's place it into the JavaScript mode, and then let's say isOpen, and then conditional rendering like this. Now in this case, here also this should be a plus, not a minus. And so let's also come here and say isOpen, then show the minus, and if not, then please show the plus. Close the JavaScript mode. And so with this, we have the pluses showing. All right. Now all we need to happen is that, of course, when we click here, the box should actually open. So you see that with the CSS style, I applied this hand cursor here to the entire div. So to the entire element. And so this is where we then want to listen for the click event. So right here on this div. So let's say on click, and then here we will pass in a function called handle toggle. And so let's go define that function. So just like before, we just define an outside function with the keyword of handle here, which is totally optional, but it makes it easy to understand that this is a function that will be used as an event handler. And so now here, let's use set isOpen, and then we take the current one. So we can just call it current if we want. Of course, we can also call it isOpen. Yeah, anything works. And then we just want to do the opposite. All right. So that didn't work yet. Maybe let's just reload here. That is sometimes necessary. And yes, that works. And if I close again, it closes. Beautiful. Now here we have some errors, and that's just because of the key prop. So here we need to pass in a unique key prop, and we could now actually use I, which is unique actually. So it's this 0, 1, and 2 coming from the array iteration, but it's better to not rely on that and instead use something that's truly unique. So that's, for example, the title of each element. Close this one here. And indeed, it works on all of them. There's just one small detail missing, which is that when this is open, we get this green border here and all the text becomes green. So that's just one special class that gets added to the item whenever it is open. So on the item, that's right here. So again, we want to add a second class here in case that it is open. And so for that, we need some more conditional rendering, basically, in this case of classes. So here we now need to construct a template string or a template literal, which already has the item string. And then here, based on a condition, so based on is open, we either want to add open or nothing. And that's it. And that works. Well, this kind of didn't become green for some reason. Let's check out our CSS here maybe. Maybe there's something that I didn't do right. Yeah, so here it should be title. Yes, beautiful. And with this, we actually finished this accordion, at least for now. So later in this section, there is the second part of this exercise where we will make it a bit more realistic, where only one of these three can be opened at the same time. So moving on now, it's time to learn about yet another fundamental concept that we use all the time in React development, and that is the children prop. So we have finished this project right here, and so we can basically finish this with Control C. And so now if we reload, you immediately see that the connection has been lost, or you could also simply have closed this VS Code window right here. Okay. And now what I want to do in this lecture and the next one, as I introduce you to the children prop, is to use the steps component that we built before. So let's go back to the steps folder and open it up in VS Code. And again, you can do that in any way that you wish. Now I will now actually duplicate this file. So this app.js in which we are working, I will copy and then paste so that we can keep the first version of the code that we wrote. So calling this one app version 1. And so now we can continue the work here in this file. All right, so let's here come to the terminal and then write npm start so that our project opens up again here in the browser. All right. Yeah, remember how we had actually included the steps component here twice. So let's remove or comment out one of them. And so yeah, it's gone. And as always, it's important to keep the console open and maybe also the components tree. But for now, let's stay on the console. Okay, so the idea of this lecture is to create a reusable button that we can use instead of these two ones here. And I want to add an emoji to these buttons here as well. So let's take a look at where they are. Yeah, so these two buttons here. Again, I now want to create a reusable button that we use instead of these two. So let's do that. And we start by using the knowledge that we already have. So let's say function button. And then all this will do is to return a button element, which should also have this style here and an on-click event handler. So let's just copy these two here. And also let's place some text here for now. And so now the idea is that we can pass in the background color, this on-click handler here, and the text as props. So basically we want to accept some props here for the text color. So let's actually call that text color. So text color, background color, the on-click handler, and also the text. And so then here, let's use that button actually. So before we keep working on the button, let's include it here immediately. Let's right away delete this one. And so we use our component that we are building right now. So let's say text color should be this one here. Or actually that's the background color, of course. So BG color, then the text color. This one should be FFF for white, and then also the on-click prop. And here we want to specify the handle previous function. All right, then we close. And also the text. So here, this one said previous. And so now let's come to our button down here, and let's use these values here instead of the hard-coded values. So here, background color should be the BG prop that we received, and this one should be the text color that we receive as a prop. Then here we want on click, and here, instead of just this generic text, we want, again, the text that we receive as a prop. So let's give it a save, maybe reload even, and you see, as we use this button, it still works and looks exactly the same as before. So let's then do the same thing with this one here. So that's just copy and pasting this one, and then changing the on-click handler to handle next, and here next. Let's delete this button. And so now with this, we have exactly the same functionality as we had before, but we extracted these buttons that we had here into a reusable button component, which right now accepts the text color, the background, the on-click handler, and the text. So passing all these data here as props into this component should be pretty clear at this point. So hopefully you understood exactly how that works in previous lectures. But anyway, let's now say that we also want to add an emoji. So that's easy enough. We just accept that here as a prop. So emoji, and then let's add that here before the text. And let's actually create a span element for this emoji. So we create a span, and then in there, we put our emoji and then the text. Okay, and then let's actually pass that emoji in. And then let's here maybe search for finger, because I want this one here for previous. And then one finger pointing in the opposite direction for next. So that's this one. Okay, give it a save. And yeah, that worked nice. So we have our emojis and our text, and it works exactly as we specified our button down here. But now let's say that I wanted this emoji here to be on this left side, but the other emoji on the right side, so that it would say next, and then pointing right to the right side. So with this, we kind of have a problem, because we already have so many props. And so do you think that we should add yet another prop basically for this direction? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's getting a little bit too crazy here with all these props, and we could keep adding more and more to customize this button even more. But I think at this point we should not add, for example, this one here, like for the direction or for the side of the emoji, and instead make use of the children prop that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So instead of passing in this side here, this emoji and the text, which are basically the content here of this button element, what if we could simply pass the content right into the button as well? Or in other words, what if we could pass simply some JSX into the component, and then the component could use that JSX and simply display it? Well, we can actually do that in React. So let's come up here and notice how up until this point, all our components have always been self-closing. So we never had like this, and then any content, and then closed the element. So we never had this before, but in fact, we can do exactly this. So just like we do with HTML elements, where we have an opening tag, then some content, and then a closing tag, we can do exactly the same with React components. So here, of course, I don't want that gibberish. Let's just put it back for now. But basically what we want is to now here write that span with the emoji. So this one, and then previous. So this is exactly what we want as the content of this button. And if we were writing the button as a simple HTML button, this is what we would write. So that's actually exactly what we did right down here inside this button. And so again, we can do exactly the same thing with our React components. So then we no longer need this and this. And let's then do the same thing here. And so now comes that part where we can very easily change the direction or the side of the emoji, because we can simply write next, and then we put our emoji in the JSX on the right side. So easy, right? Well, I forgot to close our button here. Okay. And now, of course, you don't see any content here anymore because we no longer are passing in the text and the emoji. And so now it's time to fix this. So basically now it is time to give the button element access to whatever content we wrote into the opening tag and the closing tag. And so that's where finally the children prop comes into play. So the children prop is a prop that each React component automatically receives. And the value of the children prop is exactly what is between the opening and the closing tag of the component. So let's remove all of this. And then we simply need to write children. And so this really is a predefined keyword inside React. And so, as a final step, we can remove all of this and simply use the children here. Give it a save. And there we go. Beautiful. So we have exactly what we set out to build. We have the emoji here on the left side and here on the right side. And of course, we could do anything here. So we could have even more emojis, even more elements. And yeah, we could do really whatever we wanted. Because this content here of this element would simply be passed as the children prop into the button. And then here we use that children prop and display all that content right here inside this HTML button. And with this, we just gained a brand new and really, really important tool that is used all the time in React. It's actually one of its most useful features, I would say. And the reason for that is that it allows us to make our components truly reusable. So with this children prop, I am now able to pass whatever content I want into this button element. And the button component doesn't even need to know what content this is going to be. All it does is to take the children, so all the content and all the JSX that we just passed in, and will simply then render it inside this button component. And so because of that, we can think of the children prop as a hole that can be filled by us passing in the content into that component. And if for some reason this seems strange, don't worry, we will use this children prop all the time, all the way until the end of the course. And now, just to finish, let's quickly recap what we just did here. So, by using the children prop in the button component, we basically left an empty hole right in the component that we could then fill with any JSX markup that the component receives as children. But then the question is, how do we pass in these children? Well, when we include the button component in some JSX, instead of immediately closing the element, we can write some more JSX into that element. So just like we can write any HTML markup inside other HTML elements, right? So just like in HTML, we can write anything that we want between the opening and the closing tag of the component that we are using. So in this example, this piece of JSX creates the elements that are then the children of the button component, and they will then be accessible inside that button as props.children. So that's why we say it is the children prop. So basically, by defining child elements like this, we are passing them into the button just like we can pass in any other prop. The difference is in the way in which we specify other props, so the more regular props, and this one. So by passing in content between the opening and the closing tag of an element, we basically fill the hole that we left in the component by using props.children in the JSX of that button, so of that button component. So if we think about this, the children prop is really an ideal way of making reusable and configurable components, especially when it comes to the content of the component. So for example, let's say that we wanted to create a second similar button, but with some other emojis and text. Well, now that we know about the children prop, that is really easy. All we have to do is to pass in some different JSX, and then the button gets completely different content. And this technique is really useful for building generic components that do not know about their content before actually being used. Like, for example, a modal window, a generic slider, or simply a generic button like the one that we just built. So again, this button component had absolutely no idea about the content that it was receiving, and therefore about the content that it was displaying. And so this is really amazing to create generic and reusable components. So using the children prop like this is really an extremely powerful technique that you will need to master as you learn React. But we will use this over and over again, and so there will be plenty of time to practice. And actually starting right in the next video. Let's now build another reusable component by leveraging the children prop once again. And this time, let's say that we wanted a component to display a message. And so that message will always be this paragraph element. It will also always contain this step here, for example, in an H3 element. And then it will contain in an H3 element, so like this. And then it will contain something that we pass in. So some content such as this message right here. So let's once again use the children prop in order to create such a component. So this component I'm going to call the step message. So step message. And then I will for now just copy this. So copy all of this. And so, as I said, we want basically always to display the current step and then here whatever content that we get. So we need to receive two props here. First is this step. And then again, the children prop, which each component, remember, automatically receives as soon as we pass in some content between the opening and the closing tag when we use the component. So now we got the step, and then right after that step, let's simply display whatever children that we receive. So this part here is then that empty hole that we talked about in the last lecture. And this empty hole can then of course be filled with whatever we pass in. And again, whatever we pass in between the opening and the closing tag of step message. So here in the button, that hole was basically all the content of the button. So the button here only displays exactly what was passed in. But here we will also, in addition, always display this part. So the H3 with the step itself. Okay, and now let's, where is that? Yeah. So let's now replace this message right here with the step message. Now the step, of course, we have to pass in just like any other prop. Not span, step. Okay, and now here between the opening and closing tag, we basically define the children prop. So this here will then become the children prop. And if you get rid of all this, then let's see what happens. Well, nothing really happened. Of course. I mean, we didn't really return anything here. So we just wrote some JSX, but we didn't return it. We also get some warning here that the H3 cannot be inside of a P. So let's then replace this P just with a div. Give it a save, and there it is. Beautiful. So it always displays the current step and of course the message that we had before, because we passed that in right here, and so that is exactly what we had before as well. And now of course we could reuse this anywhere we wanted. So let's say that here, after the steps, we wanted somewhere else in the app also to have a step message. Let's say step number 1. And then here maybe the content is pass in content. Let's do another paragraph with some emoji here. It does not matter at all what we have here. And so then here we have step 1 like this, and we can do as many as we want. So let's copy paste that. Let's say, for example, step 2, read children prop, and then maybe some other emoji. Give it a save. And so now we have, again, created a reusable component here that we can use anywhere in our application and give it any content that we want. And it will always, as you see, display this step here with the number that we gave it, and then whatever content that we passed into it. So into the component itself. Let's come back here. And here I just thought that maybe we could use our button again. So why not? And then it makes even more sense to have these different props, because now we can basically customize them in a different way. So let's say here we wanted a different background color and a different text color. These should be strings like this. And we're missing the onClick event handler. And so here, let's just define an inline function. And the emphasis is again on defining a function. So here we need to pass in a function, not call a function. Let's just alert something here. It doesn't really matter. So let's say learn how to, and then we can just use this here, just so that it's related to each of the steps. So we opened the button, then we have the closing tag, and now we can pass whatever we want in here. And of course, this thing that we pass can also just be regular text. So I'll give it a save, And there is our button. It still works, so we are successfully passing in the onClick handler and then using it. The styling looks a little bit off, but I guess that's because I styled those one here. Well, let's see actually, just to make sure there's nothing wrong. Yeah, in fact, these buttons get these styles because they are a children of some element with the buttons class. All right, but that doesn't really matter. We could, of course, wrap this in a div with the class of buttons. That might work, or maybe that will then mess up some other styling. Well, that didn't really work, but also because it's buttons. Yeah, nice. That looks better actually. And so with this, we can see that we were really able to customize, once again, our button here. Some parts with normal props, like these three, and then the content itself here with the children prop. So if we always just want to pass in a string, this could of course also be a normal prop. But since sometimes we want some other content, like here with some actual JSX, like this span element here, well, then we should really take advantage of the children prop. And now to really drive this message home so that you really understand how to work with this important children prop, let's go back to our accordion component exercise and use it there as well. Let's now take everything that we learned throughout this section in order to make the accordion that we started building earlier a bit better and a bit more real world. And here it is. So just like before, when I click on one of the items, then it will open. But when I click on another one, then only this one stays open and all the other ones are closed. So basically what this means is that now each of the items no longer controls whether they are open or not. Instead, it is now the accordion who knows which of the items are opened, and then only that item basically is allowed to be open. So for example, if item number 3 is the one that's currently opened, then number 1, 2, and 23 need to be closed. So again, all of these items here need to know which is the currently open item. And so that means that we now need to move our state from the item onto here the accordion. Now I still have the code here from the part 1 of the exercise, and to let me now fork this so I can basically leave the other part unchanged. But you can totally also work on top of version 1. So then you only have that one. So let's now remove this piece of state, because again, now each item no longer controls whether it is open or not. And then we get a bunch of errors, but that's not a problem. For now, at least. So here, let's now create that piece of state I was talking about, which will be current open. And so here we will store the number of the item that is currently open. Set is open use state, and we will start with null. So then none of them will be open in the beginning. So again, this cur open state variable will basically hold the number, so this number right here, of the item that is currently open. And so then we pass that cur open into the accordion item, and then from there it can calculate whether it is currently open or not. So let's do that. Let's pass cur open in. So we use a prop called cur open to pass that in, and then we also need to pass this setter function in, so that then down here in the item we can set the current item to the one that has been clicked. And here let's use the convention we used before, which is to start with the on prefix. So let's say on open set is open. And now here let's then receive those props. So cur open and on open. Here, let's for now just comment this out to get rid of this error right there. And then here, as I was saying, we can basically calculate whether this item is currently opened or not. So we can say, again, is open. So bringing back the variable name from before. And then if the number of this item is equal to the currently open one. So in that case, is open will be true, and then it will be, well, displayed as open. So let's change this here from null to 1, and so that works. So remember that these one add 1, and so this is 0, 1, and 2. So if I set 2, then that one is open, and then with 0, the first one is open. Great. So we created a state variable, we used it in the UI, this time by passing it into the item, and then using it to compute whether the item is currently the open one or if it's not. All right, let's set this back to null, because of course now we want to update the state by clicking on each of these. So that's right here. So let's get rid of all that, and then let's use our onOpen function. And here it's very simple. All we want to do is to pass in the number. So for example, if we are here in item number 1, then when we click, onOpen will run with number 1. And remember that onOpen is basically setIsOpen, which should be called setCurrentOpen. All right. So we run it with number 1, and so then the state curOpen becomes 1. And then what happens down here again is that 1 is equal to 1. And so then that item will become open, and all the other ones will stay closed. For example, this one here, item 0, well, item 0 is different than 1. So is open is false. And that works beautifully. Great. And I know this can be pretty confusing because we're passing state up and down, but this is basically just the idea of lifting up state. So before we had the state right here in each item, but then suddenly all of them need to know about the current state. And so therefore we can say that we lifted state up to the closest parent. All right, so after this exercise is done, please take some time to analyze the data flow here in great detail. I'm just moving a bit faster here because we already learned about all of this, and this is just an exercise. Okay, now next up what I want to do is to use our knowledge about the children prop. So instead of passing the text in here like this, it's actually a lot nicer to define the text basically as content. So let's pass that text in here. So l.text, and let's close this. And indeed, now the text is temporarily gone. So we no longer need this prop here, but we need the children prop, which I like to add either to the end or to the beginning of this list. And then here, that's no longer text, but children. Yeah, that works great. And with this, we are a lot more flexible when it comes to the kind of content that should be displayed in each of the items. So let's add one manually here. And so that's where that 23 comes from in the demo that I showed you earlier. So outside this loop, let's now create just one test one here. Test one. And this should actually be a string, I guess. The number, let's say 22. Here, let's again repeat the title. And as for the content, let's just come here and copy this. You can write it by hand if you want, or you can just write really whatever you want. So just wrapping this here in a P. this one in a UL. And each of these here, simply one LI. So just, I mean, this is not really necessary. This is just to show you. Okay. And so if we click here now, you see that we are able to pass in this entire JSX as the content. And so that's again, thanks to the children prop. So here, of course, we only have text, but yeah, here we have this entire piece of HTML, basically. And of course, our entire functionality here of the accordion still works just like before. So we can only have one of them open at the same time. Now there's just one small thing missing, which is that when we click here on an opened one, it doesn't close, right? So probably you can see that for yourself. And so what we need to do now is to basically set the state to null whenever it is opened already. So when we click here and it is already open, then the new state, so the new current open, should become null. And only otherwise it should be the number. And so that will fix it indeed. Great. So that exercise is finished as well. And I hope you found it useful. And now, as I said before, please take some time to analyze the code and the data flow right here in this component. And then once you're done, you are ready for the mandatory coding challenge in this section. Let's once again finish a section with a nice coding challenge so that we can practice everything that we learned in this section. And I can't stress enough how important these challenges are. So please don't skip this video right now. So we are going to build this very simple tip calculator. So here you can input how much the bill was. So let's say $100. And then you can say how satisfied or dissatisfied you were with the service and your friend. So let's say that two people were out for dinner, and then basically together you decide how much the tip should be. So for example, if you say it was good, that can be 10%, but your friend says 0%. And so then the average between the two of you is 5%, which is indeed these $5 here. And so the final bill is $105, which is 100 plus the $5 tip. And of course, if your friend found it absolutely amazing, then here the average between the two of you is 15, and therefore it is a $15 tip. And as you change the value here, of course, it keeps updating down here. You also have this reset button that you can click, which will set everything back to the initial values. Now, as you build this, I want you to create one separate component for each of these pieces. So this one here should be one component. For example, it can be called the bill input. Then you should have one component for this, for example, called select percentage, and then reuse that component here again. So with some different text, but it should be the same component. Then here you have some output component for displaying this text, and then a reset component just for this button. Okay? Now these three inputs here, they are of course controlled elements, and so you can start by adding their state value into the component itself, but you will soon notice that you actually need this state in the parent component, because you will need it to calculate this output right here. So then you will have to use the technique of lifting state up, and so hopefully you remember all the logic of how that works and why we have to do that. And in case there is still some doubt, you can always go back and check out the lectures where we talked about lifting up state. And of course, all the other things that you need here in this challenge. So I'm aware that this challenge is not super easy, but that's what many students actually want. So last time I asked, the large majority wanted really hard challenges. So this is not really hard, I think, but it can be a bit challenging. So it's not just 100% straightforward. Therefore, if you run into any issues, that's no problem at all. So just write the part that you can, and then the rest, watch my solution. That's 100% fine. The most important part is that you start writing at least some code and that you try it on your own. And that's enough talk. I see you here in 5 or 10 or whatever time that you need. All right, so we have a lot of code to write, so let's get straight into it. So I will start with the function called tip calculator, which we will then call basically right here. So we need no styles for this app at all. So that's why I didn't provide any CSS starter files. Okay, let's close down the sidebar here. And then let's start by writing out all our components. So the next one is called bill input. Then let's create select percentage. And of course, your component names here can be completely different. Then we have function output. And finally, for reset. All right, now let's build them out one by one. And we can actually start here in the tip calculator, because all that's going to happen here is that I will basically include all the other ones. So let's just create a div here. Then I will want the bill input. I will want 2 select percentages. And of course, we will later on then pass the props into. Here I'm just, again, building the static parts without any data at all. So then we will have the output, and we will have our reset button. Okay, let's start with this one. Okay. Then I will place this one into a label. How much was the bill? And then finally we have our first input of the type text. And let's add a placeholder as well, which is always nice. And so, yeah, here we got already some, something on the UI. I was just thinking of getting rid of this class. And so then we get rid of basically all the styling altogether. We can just come here to the CSS if we want. And just like this, just to make the font family a bit nicer on the eyes. But anyway, here let's again return a div. And then we have a select element. And as you already know, then inside the select, we have our different options. So 0 is for dissatisfied, which is 0%. Then let's just copy this over a few times. 5, 10, and 20. It was okay is 5%. Then it was good is 10%. And then 20% is for absolutely amazing. Now, we also want some text here, and so we could pass that here in as a prop, but I believe it's a lot nicer to write it right here directly. So how did you like the service? Then close that. And so basically including the content between the opening and the closing tag. How did your friend like the service? All right. And now I hope you remember how we get this text here, so this content, into select percentage. And that's right. It gets automatically passed in here as the children prop. And so let's create a paragraph or maybe a label with exactly that. There you go. That looks a lot better. So let's move on here. Return. And here we will have an H3. You pay X, which is some dollars. Let's say A plus B for the tip. So just some placeholders here for now, because we are building still the static version. And now finally here, a button that says reset. Okay, so that took us some time just to build the static part, and now let's add some state. And the best way to start is to create one piece of state for each of these three controlled elements that we need here. Now, as I started by saying in the very beginning, you could have started by creating local state right here in the component. So basically like we learned before. However, you would then quickly discover that you need this input value here, for example, right here in the tip calculator component, because it's here where you will later calculate this tip value right here, so that you can then display it. So you can pass it into output and then render it there. Therefore, I will actually basically immediately lift that state up and not even write it in the bill input. So bill and setBill are equal to use state, and for some reason, sometimes this doesn't really work with the importing. So then let's do it manually. Use state from React. Nice. And actually here, let's start with an empty string. Okay. And then we need to pass both of them in, because of course we will want to update that state each time that the change event is fired here on the input. Remember that? So that's just how controlled elements work. It's always the same recipe, always the same thing, no matter if the state lives right in this component or in another parent component. But the idea is the same, as you will see again in a minute. So let's pass in a prop called bill with the value of bill, and then let's again use our on prefix. So on setBill will be setBill. But of course, it would be just as valid to pass in a prop with exactly this name. So here we receive bill and on setBill, and let's then use these values here. So the value of this input field should be bill, and when it changes, then we want to basically set the bill based on e.target.value, and we need to convert that whole thing to a number. Okay, now unfortunately the DevTools don't work, as we experienced a few times already. But in order to see it, we can actually pass it in here into the output. So bill is bill, because remember how we actually display that bill value right here. So that's exactly this 80 right there. So let's then receive it here. So that's this first value right here. So let's see. And yeah, that works beautifully. So just like any normal controlled component or controlled element, with the difference that the state doesn't live in the component itself, but in the parent component. And now let's use the exact same logic for these select percentage components. So let's create two pieces of state, one for each of them. So that's going to be %1 and set %1. And the default here is 0. And then let's just copy paste. And so this one here will take the value of %1. So the percentage prop that this one will receive will be equal to the %1 state. While this other one, so this one also gets a percentage prop, of course, but here the value will be given by this other state. And so with this, we can use the same component to set these two different state values. Okay, and now also the onSelect handler, and this one will be set %1, while again here onSelect will be set %2. All right, then down here we can receive them besides the children. So the percentage and onSelect. And so now all we have to do is value is equal to the percentage that we receive, and then on change, and then on select. So we can immediately convert to a number, e.target.value. It's always the same recipe. So now we will not be able to immediately see it here, but it seems to be working. Both of them. All right, and so now we have all our state that we need. And so based on this, we now can already calculate the tip. So how do we do that? Should we create a new piece of state for the tip here? Well, there is actually no need, and it makes no sense to do so, because the tip can be completely calculated from the bill and the percentages. And so we are in the presence of derived state. So the tip is simply the bill times the average of the two percentages. So that's %1 plus %2 divided by 2, and then the whole thing divided by 100. Because here the percentages are these actual values, so between 0 and 100, but then we need to calculate them between 0 and 1, because, well, that's how we calculate percentages. And here, I don't really agree with this parenthesis here. Let's place that right here. So with this, we calculate the average percentage and convert it to a number between 0 and 1. And then simply by multiplying it with the bill, we get the amount of the tip. And so now we are ready to also pass that here into the output. I mean, here we receive it. To pass it, it's actually here. So tip equal tip. And so we can already display that here. And then here, it's as simple as adding the two together. So let's say 100 and one was dissatisfied, the other one was amazing, and so the average is 10%, which is exactly those $10. Yep, then it becomes 20, which together makes 120. Just make the dollar sign there. And so yeah, this seems to be working just fine. All we have to do now is to make this reset button work. But that is fortunately very simple. So function handle reset, and here all we need to do is really to set all of the values back to those initial states. So set %1 back to 0, and here the same thing. And then we just pass it right here. So on reset should become handle reset, like this. And then of course the on click event handler on reset, and let's see, and beautiful. So everything back to normal. And now what we should do is to not display the button and this output whenever there is actually no tip. So then it makes no sense to display that, right? So these two things right here. So let's wrap them into the JavaScript mode, and then let's say bill greater than 0 and end. And now here we get a problem because we have one piece of JSX which has basically two top level elements, which is not allowed. So there can only be one parent element. And so once again, our fragment here is a very nice option. We don't need these. Give it a save, and yeah, now they're gone. And as soon as we start writing here, we have a tip value, and then we can see the output there and the button. Great, and that's actually it. So I believe the hard part here was to have all the state living in the tip calculator, but then having these two components here needing that state and also updating that state. So there's a lot of state passing around here with all of these props. Yeah, and then also here the tip itself. So realizing that this indeed needs to be derived state, because otherwise you would have to calculate this tip all over the place in order to keep it in sync with the bill and these both percentages. So that would be a lot of work. And instead, by having it as derived state, each time that the component re-renders as the state is updated, this value will be calculated again and can then also be rendered here onto the UI. Great, but that's enough talk. The video is running long enough already. And so, yeah, I just hope that you did at least part of this coding challenge. And any questions that you have, just post them in the Q&A along with your solution if you'd like. So it's always nice to see different approaches resulting in the same working application. And with this, we then actually reach the end of the section, but also of part 1, basically. All we have to do, if you want, is now a complete practice project that is coming up next. So it's a really cool project once again, and so I highly encourage you to not skip it and meet me there as soon as possible.